Thank you, Mr. President. 50 years ago today, Congress enacted the Fair Housing Act, exactly 1 week after the assassination of Martin Luther King, as he sought justice for sanitation workers in Memphis. Came just weeks after the Kerner Commission issued its report on the origins of urban unrest in the 1960s. This report contained the now famous warning that, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal." In the wake of these events, the Fair Housing Act made discrimination in the sale, the rental, the financing of housing illegal for the first time. For generations, redlining, restrictive covenants, outright discrimination kept families of color locked out of entire neighborhoods, often far from where jobs were, and they created segregated communities that linger to this day. They denied these families the opportunity to build wealth through home ownership. Many of these exclusionary practices were carried out by private entities and local governments. But as Richard Rothstein reminds us in his new book, The Color of Law, and I recommend to everybody listening that they read that book, as Richard Rothstein reminds us in his new book, The Color of Law, federal policies also played a significant role in reinforcing segregation. From 1934 through 1962, 30 years, 3 decades, 98% of all FHA mortgages went to white homeowners. 98% in a country that in those days was about 10% African American. 98% of mortgages went to white homeowners. The Fair Housing Act made this despicable discrimination illegal. It required that federal housing and urban development grants be administered in a way that, quote, would affirmatively further fair housing. Not in a reactive way, but would affirmatively further fair housing. State and local governments, public housing authorities were required to use their federal funds in ways that would reverse rather than accelerate or reinforce segregation in their communities. April 11th, 1968, however, was not the end of our work to ensure fair housing and equal opportunities. 50 years later, we haven't had the progress we should have had. So much more needs to be done. A new report this year from the Center for Investigative Reporting analyzed tens of millions of mortgage records and found that all across the country, people of color are far more likely, even holding constant for economic situations, people of color are far more likely to be turned down for a loan, taking account factors like their income and the size of the loan. We know that the 2008 housing crisis hit communities of color particularly hard. In a run-up to the crisis, family mortgages were targeted to people of color. Even those who qualified for no frills, no surprises, prime mortgage were often instead steered into a subprime, much riskier loan. Even African American and Hispanic borrowers with higher incomes than other borrowers found themselves in risky subprime designed to fail products. These practices of discrimination stripped a generation worth of equity from communities that had fought hard for equal access to homeownership. I know in my community in Cleveland, in the southeast side of Cleveland, in the Broadway, Harvard area of that community where so much wealth has been lost, and as people finally began to gain in homeownership and wealth accumulation, what happened in 2006 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 devastated these communities. As a number of my colleagues have heard me say, in my zip code, 44105, Cleveland, Ohio, in 2007, the first half of that year, there were more foreclosures than any zip code in the United States of America. The household wealth of communities of color still hasn't recovered. My neighborhood hasn't. My community hasn't. My state hasn't. Middle-class Black and Hispanic families lost half their wealth from 2007 to 2013, half their wealth. Middle-income Black household wealth was $63,000 in 2007. A decade later, $38,000. The numbers are similar for Hispanic households, $85,000 down to $46,000. Borrowers with these higher cost loans were foreclosed on and about triple the rate of borrowers with standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgages. Over a recent 8-year period, 9.3 million homeowners lost their homes through foreclosure, distressed sales, surrendering their home to the lender. After the crisis, we took steps to fight this discrimination. We had created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to look after bank customers, to help root out discrimination. We required lenders to report more detailed data so we can more easily spot modern-day redlining. 2015, HUD issued the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. This rule would have given clearer guidelines to communities to help them assess their own fair housing needs and provided them with the data they need to inform their decisions. It would have allowed them to set their own goals and timelines. Some of the questions communities would ask during these assessments would demand they think in new ways about how to create housing and economic opportunities for all of their residents, no matter color, no matter family size, no matter their disability if they have one. These are the types of questions this body told the country to ask when it enacted the Fair Housing Bill 5 decades ago. But instead of recommitting ourselves to the promise we made 50 years ago, too many Washington politicians are trying to take us backward. Earlier this year, HUD suspended implementing the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. That won't reverse the requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Instead, it hurts communities which will once again be left to comply with the law without the technical assistance they need. And remember that new data that banks were going to report to make it easier to spot lenders that discriminate? The bill the Senate passed last month, right here, would exempt 85% of banks from reporting the data they're collecting and reporting today. So, Mr. President, we're not even going to know what happened. We're not even going to know. This body has scaled back the amount of data we're trying to gather to stop discrimination. Without it, we can't monitor trends in mortgage lending. It'll be harder to see who has access to affordable mortgage credit and, importantly, who does not have access. HUD is even thinking about changing its mission statement in ways that diminish the importance of combating housing discrimination. The administration's actions over the past year make it clear they're already wavering in that commitment. For example, 2017, HUD withdrew guidance requiring equal access for transgender people in homeless shelters. Let's pick on them even more. According to a report in the New York Times, Dr. Carson's HUD has suspended several anti-discrimination investigations, including an investigation of discriminatory housing advertisements on Facebook. The administration proposed a 14% cut to the HUD budget, including affordable housing and community development programs aimed at creating housing and opportunity for low-income communities. So we know, Mr. President, that one-fourth of renters in this country spend at least 50% of their income on housing. One thing goes wrong in their lives, they're evicted or they lose their homes. One thing goes wrong. One-fourth of people in this country who rent are paying at least half their income in housing costs. In Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, the second largest, about tied now, populous county in Ohio, one-fourth of all family units, one-fourth of all residents, homeowners or renters, spend half their income on housing. So it's not just renters, it's often homeowners too. So we are deciding in this body, because the president wants to, and the far right in this body wants to cut spending on housing even more. We have enough money, Mr. President, to do a huge tax cut for the richest people in the country. The richest 1% will get 81% of that tax cut. It will mean millions. I was talking to an accountant the other day in Elyria, Ohio, and I was asking him, it's tax season, of course, and he's busy, and he said, you know, when people come and see me, they ask, inevitably, when I'm doing their taxes, they ask, well, how does this tax bill affect me? And he says, you a billionaire? And they laugh and say, of course not. And he said, well, only if you're a billionaire will affect you. Then you'll save millions of dollars in your taxes. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's what that tax bill is all about. So if you're a billionaire, if you're a decamillionaire, if you made $1 million last year, you're going to save a whole lot on your taxes this year. But if you're living in sort of working class housing, if you can't afford much more than the basic very basic kind of housing, or even worse than that, you're going to see budgets cut. You're going to see fewer vouchers. You're going to see less funding for housing. So what kind of government is this? This mean-spiritedness, more tax cuts for the richest people in the country, and let's stick it to people that are barely making it. Let's they're people making 10, 12. These are people making $10 and $12 an hour. They make $10 and $12 an hour. We're going to cut their Medicaid. They're making $10 to $12 an hour. We're going to scale back their SNAP benefits. Making $10 to $12 an hour, we're going to undermine their housing subsidies. And I mean, what is all of that about, Mr. President, in this new government that we're living in now? The last thing we ought to do, at a time when a quarter of all renter households, 400,000 in Ohio alone, are paying more than a quarter of their income in rent. So 400,000 families in my state of almost 12 million, 400,000 families pay a quarter of their income in housing costs. A quarter of them pay half of their income in housing costs. Again, one thing goes wrong. Their car breaks down going to work. Can they come up with $500 to fix their car? Probably not. And then what happens? Then they're evicted. And then everything goes upside down because they can't pay their rent, so they get evicted. The kids got to go to a new school district. They lose most of the things they have. They've got to find a place to live. They probably don't have the money for the down payment to live in their that a landlord charges. A few years ago, I hosted a discussion with some of my colleagues, invited Matthew Desmond, the author of the book Evicted. In the front of the book, he scribbled the phrase, "Home equals life." If you don't have decent housing, it's pretty hard to put a stable life together for you and your family. One of the things he said in that book is when you get your paycheck every 2 weeks or once a month, he said the rent eats first. You got to pay your rent. If you can't afford to pay your rent, you can barely afford to pay your rent, you can't do much else. That simple statement captures so much. A safe, stable home is the foundation for opportunity. So this government's going to give tax cuts to the richest people in the country, and we're pulling the rug out from under people that are working every bit as hard as we do in this body, Mr. President. Many of them work harder than we do, just trying to get along in $8 or $10 or $12 an hour. We're denying people the opportunity of living in a safe, stable home. That's why we must redouble our commitment to fair housing. It's why we must take real proactive steps. My colleagues and I have legislation, the Fair and Equal Housing Act of 2017, that would add gender identity and sexual orientation to those protected from discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. Rather than take us backward, Mr. President, we must take these sorts of actions to give more Americans the opportunity to have a safe, stable home, to build wealth through home ownership. We must constantly work towards Dr. King's vision, killed 50 years ago this month, Dr. King's vision of equality and equal opportunity for all.